Thanks everyone for being here for the first of 3 different talks this month on coffee. Before we go any further, you guys have seen that we've got coffee over here. Nick, do you want to talk about some of that?
Well, we've got a Café du Monde, which is actually like a chicory blend. You want to know what chicory is? We'll talk about it a little bit later. But it's coffee that also has this other product mixed in with it. Very popular in New Orleans. We also have on the right a honey process from Honduras, which we'll talk about today. And I can't see the other one. It's from Terrazoo. You probably know a little bit more about this Costa Rica Terrazoo one.
The Terrazoo coffee is made using the wet process. And we're going to talk about the wet process of coffee. We're going to talk about coffee processing along the way. So we wanted to have some different samples of some of the types of coffee that we're talking about. Even the coffee with the chicory added, which is a separate plant root that's ground up and added for flavor. So help yourself, during the talk, get up and, pour yourself a cup, and maybe afterwards you can tell us what you think about those. But we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here, everybody. As I mentioned, this is the first of 3 talks we're going to have this month on coffee. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to Ann Dodder, Director of the Honors Office, and all her folks there for suggesting that we do this in the first place. When we were talking in the hallway, I thought it was a great idea in so many ways, and it kind of touches into something that Nick and I are going to mention to you guys at the end of the program. Also to Jody Dietz and the Collab for hosting us and for all of the logistics for getting all this set up for us, so it's always appreciated. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to put the mic down here. So I'm Steve Giambrone. This is Nick Wesemann. I'm in the science division. I teach biology courses, specifically botany, that would connect to this topic. And of course, Nick is a chef, pastry chef, certified pastry chef. So this is where we're coming from our connections to this topic. Very quickly, and I don't want to take too much more of our time, but for me, when I thought about doing this type of talk and also the program that Nick and I are putting together for a year and a half from now, it stemmed from how much coffee consumption we have, all around us. Before the pandemic, you could walk around. I think we had, 5 different coffee shops at different locations. And I noticed that, we, students, faculty, staff, we consume a lot of coffee products. And I always thought to myself, being the botanist, how much do people really know about this product? Where it comes from, where does it grow? How does it get processed? How does it get here? How does it get in your cup? So this is what promulgated me to be interested in this and putting this together. So just some statistics for those of you who don't know. I know we all love coffee. Yes, other Americans love coffee. Just, this is pretty current as of this year. Coffee consumption up 37% it's at a 20-year high. 67% of Americans have had coffee in the last day. And I think it's about 75% of Americans have had coffee in the last week. By age, demographic, it's kind of split down there. You can see that people 60 years and older are the largest, have the largest percentage of coffee drinkers in that, of that section of the demographic. But 18 to 24-year-olds, that's the fastest growing, even though it's a small percentage of those people who drink coffee. That's been the fastest growing. And in terms of the growth of coffee consumption, most of it has been noticed in the the instant preparation coffee, so like things like Keurig, those types of little coffee cubes that you can put in and push a button and then coffee comes out. But what's interesting to me, of course, and hopefully the rest of you, is that over half of the people want to buy coffee that's certified good for the environment and good for the farmers and good for the earth and what have you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sustainability of coffee in this as well. Wrong way. There we go. Which countries are the most addicted to coffee? There's kind of a trend as you look at the top. A lot of those countries are Scandinavian countries, so long dark months. Kind of understandable there. What's interesting about Brazil is that Brazil is by nation the #1 producer of coffee, and they're a pretty good consumer of coffee as well. United States is kind of down in this list in terms of, this is per capita consumption in kilograms. So 3.5 kilograms, that's just under 8 pounds of coffee, if you want to convert that to pounds for the U.S. As I said, where does coffee come from? The nations, by nation, in terms of production. Brazil is the top, national producer of coffee. But if you look around at the other countries that are listed, there's a trend. So you may already know this, but everybody, should understand that, coffee is grown only in certain parts of the planet. In fact, anywhere between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is about 25 degrees north and south of the equator, is the band where the coffee plant is able to grow. It doesn't mean you can't grow a coffee plant in a greenhouse or even in your house. I have got a botany colleague who has a very mature coffee plant. It's about this tall in his living room, and yes, it does produce flowers and fruit. He's not getting much, he's not brewing coffee from it because it doesn't make very many cherries, but as a proof of concept, you can do that, but you're not going to be able to produce any kind of product at quantity. We're going to talk about different types of coffee in terms of the botanical origins, but most of the people, when you think of coffee, you're thinking of Arabica coffee. The coffee at Starbucks, or the roastery, or Parisi, or all the places you might go around town are serving Arabica coffee. And the Arabica coffee is very, very limited in where it can grow. So we're talking about an altitude of 3,500 to 6,000 feet. Right here, we're right at about 1,000 feet, between about 950 and 1,000 feet elevation above sea level. So this is, higher elevation. It has a narrow temperature range at which it can tolerate, successful growth and, producing fruit. It needs enough rain, and of course, it needs the right humidity. So it's particular. It doesn't grow just anywhere. I know that it looks like a wall of words, but let me kind of, introduce this to you. And there's the concept here is that when we talk about coffee, there are different varieties of coffee. It's a plant that exists in nature, and it has evolved. A lot of the evolution has happened on its own, but then there's been a lot of the artificial selection that humans have done in the cultivation over the years. So down below, you can see the coffee Arabica, that bullet near the bottom. But above it, Coffea canifera is what we call Robusta coffee. So has anybody ever heard of Robusta coffee? Okay. So Robusta is considered a lower quality coffee. It's used in a lot of, like for coffee crystals, instant coffees. It could also be, the beans can be blended into the beans used for espresso drinks, blended in with the Arabica to make blends. But by itself, it's not considered to be the highest quality coffee. However, it's easier to grow. It grows in a broader spectrum of temperatures and elevations. You can even grow successful canifera or Robusta coffee at sea level. So it's more resistant to pests than Arabica coffee. So easier to grow, and if you're a farmer, that is nice, but it doesn't command the kind of the price and the market that Arabica does. I've got a little blurb there about Arabica coffee. It's tetraploid. What that means is that, and this occurred naturally, humans were twoploid or diploid. We got a set of chromosomes from our mom and a set of chromosomes from our dad. This plant, through natural processes, probably through mechanical errors in evolution, has 4 sets of chromosomes. And that's not unusual for plants. In fact, a lot of our crop plants, bread wheat, corn, are what we call polyploid, have multiple sets of chromosomes. And in some cases, it's because of human cultivation that causes that, selective breeding that results in that. But with Arabica coffee, it happened naturally in nature, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The types of coffee, in terms of the types of coffee plants, is complex. So this is a lot to digest, but what I have here, if you look at the label Coffea arabica, is actually a hybrid coffee that originated from the coniferous and another type of coffee called eugeenoides. So these two different species of coffee were hybridized naturally in nature to produce Coffea arabica, and then from there we have all of these different types. Some are the result of mutation, some are the result of human selection and cultivation. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of bourbon coffee or Typica variety coffee? When I was with my friend in Guatemala on his coffee farm, he was growing Catui, which is kind of right in the middle. There are different sub-varieties of Arabica coffee, and you're going to find these growing in all the different places around the world where coffee is grown. And what's significant about that, maybe for us, is that you would think that, you know, everybody wants to grow the best tasting coffee, which of course they do, but most importantly, you got to grow the coffee. You have to create a crop. You have to have volume. You have to have a yield. And in your particular elevation or your climate, if you can't get that to provide a yield, then you're not going to grow that because it's not going to be profitable for you. So there's a lot of variation. Human use of coffee, the evidence comes from about up to 3,000 to 6,000 years ago of the Ethiopian highlands. So we're sure that coffee originated in Ethiopia. And human use started, at least recorded human use, started there in the highlands of Ethiopia. And interestingly enough, it was probably used as a food or a food additive. The evidence suggests that the people ground it up, added it to food for, you know, a little bit of nutrition and kind of a pick-me-up. It was likely this that they were using was the Arabica type of coffee and not the Robusta type, which leads us to a myth and some folklore about coffee. So how many people have heard about Kaldi and his dancing goats? Yeah, how coffee originated, right? You know, Kaldi, a goat herd with his goats, noticed that as the goats eat these little red cherries on this one plant, they get really peppy and they have a lot of energy and they dance around and they seem really happy, which led people to start thinking there might be something behind this and changed the human consumption, at least at length. And that image is from a publication back in the 1600s by an Italian author documenting this little bit of folklore. You know, it probably didn't happen exactly that way, but just like with most folklore, there's a little bit of truth embedded in that. So, however that played out, coffee became important as a drink. People were starting to use the beans, grinding them up, roasting them, and using them as a drink. And once that started, how many people know the word mocha? Right? It's associated with coffee. And if you can see down here, the town of Mocha in the country of Yemen is made famous because that became the kind of the epicenter on the planet for both producing, processing, and then, you know, distributing coffee to the rest of the world early on. So, and of course, once that happens, and the European world takes over, and, you know, Nick can talk a little bit more about coffee houses and coffee culture in Europe as it unfolded. Again, for my botany students in the room, the genus name of coffee is Coffea, and the species name Arabica. This is actually named by a really famous biologist, the father of all biological taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist. So he was actually the one that gave the coffee its name. And as I mentioned, it is a tetraploid plant, a hybrid between Coniferous and Eugeenoides. And we think that, based on the molecular evidence, this occurred about 500,000 to 1 million years ago. So this happened naturally in nature. And this is not the first time. We know crops do this. Not even non-crop plants, but crop plants have been known to do this, right? And we're sure that it evolved at in the highlands of Ethiopia. an image of the coffee plant itself with the flowers. So coffee is a flowering plant. Flowering plants make flowers, even if they're not that pretty. Flowering plants that make flowers produce a fruit, even if the fruit is not edible. And of course, this fruit is edible, but most people aren't eating the part of the fruit that you're thinking of with most fruits that we eat. It's actually the seeds that we're after. So this image shows you the breakdown of the coffee cherry, or the fruit. We got an image here of that, right? This is the whole fruit. And of course, inside the fruit is a seed. So, you know, I know this may not be the best way to talk about this, but everybody knows what a peach is. And if you think of a peach, and you think about the exterior of the peach being the skin, and then the nice, juicy, delicious part in the middle, and nobody's going to eat the pit. You know, you want to cut that out and discard it, compost it. But inside the pit, most people think this is the seed, but it's really not the seed. This is the endocarp. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I forgot. Thanks. So this is the endocarp of the fruit, and it's inside this that is you have the seed. So the, you know, peach seed looks about like this. It's small, right? So connecting those ideas to our diagram, you know, if this was a peach, this would be the fuzzy outside. This would be the delicious, you know, juicy fruit inside that. You've got the endocarp, but in coffee, the endocarp is this kind of papery layer called a parchment. It's not a big, thick pit like it is in the peach. And then, of course, inside that, you've got the seed. And it's the seed that we're after for making coffee. But, you know, all this has to be processed. The coffee seeds, there's almost always two seeds in coffee cherry. And one of the things I want to talk about, and one of the reasons I think you should come back next week at the same time to hear our other presenters. It won't be us talking the whole time, but it'll be some guests coming in to talk about some of the social equity issues surrounding coffee around the globe. Because unless you're really focusing on the crop production in Brazil, which is a lot of machine picking, most of the coffee picked around the globe is picked by people like this, with their hands. Human hands touch every one of those cherries that has the two seeds inside that you know, make your coffee with, or you buy your coffee with. So this is an image from when I was on my friend's farm in Guatemala. These are migrant workers that were working on his farm. So again, please come back next week and join us to listen to that aspect of the coffee story. I want to talk a little bit about processing. And there's different types of processing. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. But we've got at least two of these methods represented here. One is called the natural or dry method. And that's when the coffee cherry is picked and the whole fruit is just left to dry out on patios or, you know, somewhere outside. And there's fermentation going on. There is microbial life that is producing enzymes that are changing a lot of the compounds that are in that fruit, changing the flavor profile of the seed inside, and it leads to a particular flavor. Understandably, this uses the least amount of water. The type of processing probably most of us are drinking in most of our products is called the wet process or washed. This uses a lot more water, where you can see in a little video, this is in a cooperative called Tarazu in Costa Rica that we visited with students last winter break. And they're using the wet process. A lot of water comes down this conveyor. You can see the cherries floating as they are processed through. This helps to depulp, take a lot of the cherry, mesocarp off, and then wash the seeds. You know, the seeds are dense, they fall to the bottom. And then there's more fermentation that removes a lot of the sticky pectin that sticks to the seeds. And then that dried seed with the parchment still on is raked out on these big concrete patios and dried under the sunshine. So these are students. These are some of the students that went with us down to Costa Rica, and you can see we put them to work. They weren't upset. They were happy to do it. They got the full experience. An intermediate process is called the honey process. So that one coffee that's got labeled honey, it doesn't have honey added. You know, that honey that's made from bees. That word is just used. The honey is that pectin or the mucilaginous sticky part that's found, right under all of the, coffee cherry that we looked at in one of the earlier images. So that sticks to the seed, and ordinarily the natural fermentation process would, eat that away and then it would be gone. But one way to process coffee is to leave that intact, and it changes the flavor profile. Most people say it has a mellower flavor, a little bit more a sweeter, more mellow flavor profile, but you'll have to decide that. And then really quickly, to kind of wrap up my part of the story, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the sustainability-related aspects. I want to talk about how you can buy organically grown coffee and how that works. So the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service has a certification program, and that program is usually, and for a lot of our products, managed through that second bullet, the Quality Assurance International agency that puts the labels, the organic labels on our food products. So if you go to, Whole Foods or Sprouts or places where you're getting organic food and you see that label, it's probably this organization that's providing that certification. And of course, it ensures that the food meets some of those specifications, that, pesticides, insecticides, things like that aren't being used. And that's good. Rainforest Alliance, you can read their blurb. This is their kind of introductory statement on their website that I've copied there. International organization, alliance to protect forests, improve the livelihoods of farmers, the forest communities, mitigate and adapt to climate crisis. This is all good stuff. And then we have Fair Trade Certification, which is another network of producers, organizations, making sure we put people and planet first. So these are all good things. These are good labels to look for. But I want, students and everyone to realize that, just because you see that label, it doesn't mean everything's fine. It doesn't mean that, if I buy that, then there's no problem with, the international market or, the condition of this product that we're consuming. So this I found interesting. This was an article that was recently published where this person was investigating, just what does it mean to have foods that have these labels, and are there any caveats? And of course, the point here, the risk is that we see these labels as kind of a panacea for everything's fine, and if I buy this, there's no problem. But that isn't always the case. There's some issues that even with the certified foods, that there may still be inequalities with the people that are associated with bringing these products to our table. The final thing is a link. I'm not going to click on it, but Sierra Club, I think recently, I think it's been the last 3 or 4 years, if you want to drink coffee conscientiously, they give you some ideas. And of course, along that is, buy your coffee from local small producers that are sourcing their product from in the country, from people that are trying to get, the money goes as much to the actual producers and the workers as much as possible, and that they're using the most sustainably aligned method of growing. Speaking of sustainably aligned methods of growing coffee, shade-grown coffee is what you should look for. And that is much more prominent today than it was even 20 years ago, because, the first time I visited Costa Rica, there was a lot of coffee grown on hillsides where all the plants were taken away. It was coffee as far as you can see. And of course, they had to cover the coffee with shade, with shading screens, because coffee doesn't like full sun. So kind of a backwards way of doing that. It destroys habitat. It's not good for water retention in the soil. It destroys biodiversity. So the better way is to use shade-grown coffee where you have like banana trees, other higher forest canopy trees growing, and the coffee grows below it. It's more difficult. It is more costly in the sense because it's harder to manage. It's harder to harvest. If you do a monoculture agriculture, it's easy to implement, right? It's easy to harvest and what have you. So it comes at costs. So, good sustainable coffee naturally is going to come at a higher cost. One other aspect, we talk about how our food affects climate, and of course, then the climate is affecting our food, right? So, yeah, there are some challenges to coffee as climate change continues. Those small windows where we grow coffee on the planet are becoming even smaller. The temperature ranges are more challenging because of what we know about climate change. In terms of how the food affects the climate, this was a co-op in Costa Rica called Terrazoo. I mentioned that before. And one of the things they're trying to promulgate in terms of reducing their carbon footprint is capturing a lot of the pulp that's processed off and trying to find ways to turn that into suitable compost that can go back on the farms. So this co-op is just that. It's a co-op of many, many small little local farms. All the farmers come, and now this can be, what would be thought of as waste, even though there's no such thing as waste. This waste product, the pulp, can be utilized, turned back into compost, and go back into the soil for the farmers that are part of the co-op. In fact, I've got some of the pulp. Another way that this can be turned into something that is a little bit more sustainable is turning it into consumable products by humans. So the coffee pulp can be pulverized and then dried and turned in to be used to make tea. So you can actually buy coffee pulp tea. You may not like the flavor. I've tried it. It's okay. It's not my favorite, but something that.
It's going around. It says really nice.
Yeah, you can.
I mean, it's not coffee at all, but like it's.
Yeah, you can open up and you can kind of take a sniff. It's got it almost has like a tobacco kind of flavor.
Dried fruity.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
Release. There we go. So, kind of to reiterate what he talked about the different beans. We have the Arabica beans and the Robusta beans. The Arabica beans being kind of the higher quality ones, the ones you're going to see at like, if you're buying like quote unquote nice coffee. They tend to be more flavorful. Not as much as caffeine content in them, and it was initially like the main coffee that was being used worldwide. Robusta kind of came into popularity much later in coffee's history. A lot of the Arabica plants were being wiped out by coffee rust, and as he already mentioned, Arabica beans, they're very finicky about how they grow, and they like certain altitudes and temperatures and rainfall and all this, whereas Robusta coffee is much more robust, much more hardy, but because it's like this much tougher brand, you don't necessarily get as like complex flavors and all that. So that's where you see Robusta kind of coming into popularity, and especially like in like the 50s and stuff, that's where you're seeing a lot of that coffee come into play because it was cheaper, it was easier to get, and so that was really popular in America at that time. But Robusta has less oils. It's more acidic and more bitter typically. So that we kind of associate those flavors. It's cheaper. So you'll often see this in like supermarket blends or like very kind of cheaper commodity coffee. It's used as a blend sometimes. And it's also very commonly used as in freeze-dried coffee, which I think you kind of touched on, but or as coffee crystals, instant coffee. And the way those coffee crystals are made typically is you make a very strong coffee, like almost extract or liquid, and that's either it used to be treated by a heating process where they would spray on a hot wall and gather the crystals and then rehydrate it. Anymore, I believe it's more done with like a cold process. But so you're losing all the characteristics because you're kind of creating this coffee extract anyway, which is kind of okay because Robusta isn't necessarily like the most complex flavored coffee anyway. So it lends itself kind of well to these. I'm not really looking for a really delicious cup of coffee. I'm looking more for like, I need an instant cup of coffee now and fast. But, when you talk about caffeine, right, that's kind of the main reason why people are drinking coffee. I feel like get that buzz. You find coffee naturally, you find caffeine naturally in coffee, tea. I'm going to stand up so I can look at this. Coffee, tea, and chocolate. and it's also kind of funny. He talked about how, coffee and the coffee culture kind of started in the Middle East. Once it moved up to like Europe and England, all three of these ingredients made its way to England in the same decade in time. So you had a country becoming highly more caffeinated all at once. They were kind of going from drinking beer, which why was everyone drinking beer at the time? You what? Bad water. So like by fermenting it, brewing it, it's safer to drink. Beer is actually into being safer to drink and maybe more fun than water. So, but once you bring coffee in, it's still kind of overcoming that bad water because it's brewed, the water's boiled typically. So you're kind of cutting that hazard out. But instead of kind of having a population and a workforce that is constantly drunk, or at least maybe not at their sharpest game all the time, you suddenly have people in a culture that is, they're alert, they're more productive, they're more awake. So this kind of leads to like increased alertness, focus, and productivity. So this kind of led to kind of a very big shift in like culture. People would use these coffee houses as a place to exchange ideas and like it was kind of a social area that women weren't typically allowed in. So, men would go and form business alliances and exchange ideas and talk with professors and stuff. So you kind of had this enlightenment that kind of came along with the advent of these kind of 3 caffeinated ingredients coming on. And it kind of also leads into partially kind of into the start of the Industrial Revolution, because now instead of having a workforce that's sluggish and tired all the time, you now have a workforce that's caffeinated and more productive and able to work harder and longer. So, for better or for worse, you are able to get more work out of your employees. Eventually you get the coffee break that kind of comes along later on, where at some point businesses are like, it's a benefit to me to provide these coffee breaks to my employees, because if I do so, they will produce more. And it's a whole other story. But the caffeine content can vary per cup, and it can be based around a lot of things. Like the type of roast you use is going to affect how much caffeine you get in a cup. The type of grind, the method of brewing, the type of bean, because as we talked about, Arabica has less caffeine than Robusta. So it's kind of hard to like determine like a cup of coffee has this much caffeine. There are kind of averages, but there's a lot of factors to go into how much caffeine you actually get in a cup of coffee. You of course have decaf. To me, if you're not a fan of the flavor of coffee, it's kind of like, what's the point? But even though there's different methods of decaffeinating, you have like a water, and they all have positives and negatives to it. You can soak it in water. There's some where you have solvents added to it to decaffeinate it. Carbon dioxide is kind of typically the most preferred method of decaffeinating coffee. But even when you decaffeinate coffee, it's not like truly caffeine free. You're still going to have it's like just under like 1% caffeine. So you're never going to get a truly 100% caffeine free coffee. So like just for comparison here, a 5-ounce cup of coffee still has 3 milligrams of caffeine in it. Instant coffee, 65, percolated, 80, filtered drip. These are all methods of brewing. But you kind of see your range in the standard cup of coffee is anywhere between like 70 and 110-ish compared to your 3 of decaf. So you're always going to get a little bit of a buzz. But we're talking about flavor, the soil, the altitude, the climate affects the coffee taste. Does anyone know what the term for that is? Where it grows? The terroir. So we apply this to wine a lot of times, like if you're into wine. Terroir is a kind of a term that we use to describe how all these like growing in the environment affects the coffee. Also with chocolate, anything that's like you can taste like it literally translates into like the flavor of the earth affecting it. We talked about Arabica and Robusta. And then the roast has a very big influence on flavor. So this kind of images you'll see here. You start with like the green unroasted beans. And typically when beans are brought in to America or wherever they're being imported in from, you're not typically importing roasted beans. Like big companies that are roasting their coffee, like the roastery, they're sourcing beans green, or your coffee houses that are roasting their coffees are roasting them green. The main reason kind of for that is once you roast it, and then especially once you grind it after, you want to take advantage of that flavor. So if you roast it and then ship it, you're really losing out on a lot of flavor. Plus the benefit of, roasting your own coffee is you can kind of control the roast. And depending on your roast is going to affect, it'll affect the flavor of the coffee, the caffeine, the acidity, and these are kind of all factors that you have. But the coffee does actually get darker. Typically, if you're wanting to really appreciate all that terroir and the flavors of the coffee, you're not really going to roast the heck out of it, because the darker you roast it, you're losing those that nuance that the coffee bean has, and you're really just getting the flavor of roast, caramelized, dark stuff like that. So not necessarily worse quality the darker you roast it, but I think there's different applications for a dark roast versus a lighter blonde roast, whether it's just personal taste or what you're pairing it with food. So when we have degrees of roasting, so the longer you roast a coffee, you get a stronger flavored coffee, typically more bitter the darker you roast it. You also get a lower acidity. So your breakfast roasts are going to have a little bit more acid to it. And you also get less caffeine. So if you really want that high caffeine, a lighter roast is going to preserve more of that caffeine instead of your really dark, your continental French, Spanish roasts where some of that caffeine is lost during the roasting process. But there we go. The grind size, this is another way you can influence the intensity of your coffee, the flavor, the caffeine content. So the coarser your coffee, typically, if the finer your coffee rather, you're going to have more surface area on your coffee. So when it hits the water, more flavor molecules are extracted, more sugars, those bitter compotes, things like that are going to come in contact with the water. So you get much faster flavor extraction with a finer espresso ground as you would with a coarse ground. When you're using finer grounds, you have to be very careful about how it's brewed. The longer you brew it and the more movement you get with those fine grounds, you really start leaching out more of those bitter compounds because of the surface area and the contact it has with its water. Typically, at least in most restaurant operations, and I think what most people tend to buy is drip coffee. That's your coffee maker where it goes over the coffee filter and your water drips down over it. That's typically what's really popular for most people. Also buy espresso grounds. Espresso is oftentimes also, even nice espresso is cut with a little bit of Robusta coffee, because what do we kind of associate espresso with, right? You want that fast, quick, caffeine jolt. So it's cut in there to kind of give you that punch. So different ways that you might brew it, if you're using a coarse grind, sometimes use a French press. Anyone seen a French press? You oftentimes these big glass jugs, you put your grounds and your coffee in it, let it brew, and you have the big plunger that you gently press down to separate the beans. We'll use one here briefly when we do some coffee for you. Percolator, I always kind of think of my grandparents, these very old, the very heavy metal coffee pots that you would put coffee grounds in. You'd sit over direct fire on the stove, and it just kind of boils and rolls. And what's that doing to the coffee as it sits there and rolls, right? You're washing it, you're moving the coffee around so much, and it really gives you a nice cup of mud. Kind of ends up as what you get. So, which is kind of why I didn't like coffee for a long time, because you're kind of associated with this is just overbrewed and muddy and gross. And you get down to medium for drip, extra fine for espresso, and then Turkish coffee is very powdered, pulverized. And in this method, it's typically mixed in with the water, and you actually kind of consume the coffee with it. It's not necessarily strained out. Turkish being, I don't know if you've seen the videos, but where they have the big pit of hot sand, and they take the metal cup and they'll stick your your coffee in the cup in the sand, and this hot sand brews it immediately, and they take it out. Typically served with like condensed milk and sugar, but it's very thick, very strong. I like it with a lot of sugar, a lot of cream. It's so thick. And anymore, we're seeing lots of instant or lots of other forms of coffee kind of popping up. You know, we talked about the freeze-dried coffee. That's been around for a while, but you know, it's good for that. I just want to make a cup of coffee, and I don't really care about how good it tastes. Also good for like cooking applications. You want to add flavor into like a brownie batter or something. It's a good way to add that flavor in without having to worry about coffee grounds in it. So it's a good way to add flavor to things. The frozen coffee concentrates, like the pucks, where you have this super concentrated version of coffee that you can add into water. Typically, they're marketed as still having keeping the quality and the character of the coffee. It's just processed down to where you don't necessarily butcher the flavor. Cold brew. If you want to get a really good caffeine jolt, like cold brew is kind of the way to go. It's really easy to make too. You know, buying your coffee grounds and just letting them sit overnight in a filter. You get a lot of caffeine extracted out of it, but you don't necessarily get all like the bitterness that you would get from a hot method, since you're not pulling all these flavors out. So you get like lots of acid, much brighter, less bitter coffee. But oh boy, does it have caffeine in it. Like that'll get you ready to go in the morning. Nitro, which has nitrous oxide added into it. It makes these very like creamy, almost with all the it's very fine bubbles, so it's not like carbonated bubbles, which carbonation has that very intense pop, and you get that carbonic acid that kind of, you know, kind of bites on your tongue. These are very smooth, creamy, light bubbles that kind of give the coffee a little bit more richness and body. K-cups, which we've seen. Talked about chicory, which became popular as kind of a way to cut coffee, like adding this other kind of bitter coffee-like flavored root to the coffee to expand coffee rations and do it. So if you haven't tried chicory, try that. Of course, Café du Monde in New Orleans, very famous for their chicory and their beignets, if you've ever been. And then mushroom coffee has kind of been popping up lately, right? I've seen the ads for like these blends of like mushrooms. I think that's more marketed more towards just like having more as like a health product, as opposed to like, here's a way to get your caffeine. It's kind of a way to get like, there's still a little bit of caffeine in it, but it's much less compared to coffee. But they're marketing other health benefits as kind of an alternative to that. I haven't tried them, but they do. For all these things, that's what I'm kind of seeing as being like the new kind of coffee trend coming up that's not really kind of coffee. So yeah, lots of interesting coffee things. So
do you want to, well, we want to solicit any questions you might have for us. We'd like to talk to you about that. But as we're doing that, I know we're getting kind of close on time. When we open up for questions, do you want to start brewing some? So we have some roasted coffee that actually I roasted a few days ago using the same green beans that are being circulated around, that are sourced from Costa Rica, from a place called Café San Luis, which is one of the places that we visited with students a year and a half ago, last winter break. So Nick and I are going to host another study away trip, not this coming winter break, but the next, back to Costa Rica for the same purpose. We're going to focus looking at coffee production, but we also are going to look at cacao, which is how you make chocolate, right? It's the seeds that are roasted and ground to make chocolate. So definitely come back the next week and week after for part 2 and part 3 of coffee. But fingers crossed, come back next semester, and we're going to have similar series of talks that are centered around chocolate. So Nick's got that brewing. We've also got some green beans that we're going to roast with you guys. And as we do that, here we go. Yeah, he's going to put them in there. Yeah. Questions from you guys. What kind of questions do you have?
My question is, when you're talking about roast and caffeine content, I've heard both sides of the question, which is dark roasts have more caffeine content than light roasts. And I've heard the inverse as well, which is light roast has more caffeine than dark roast. And I'm just wondering, which is it?
I've always heard light roast just because like the processing kind of takes out some of those molecules in it.
That's kind of what I thought.
But I haven't heard the opposite. But as far as I know, it's lighter roast gives you more caffeine.
Okay.
But interesting. Real quick, just kind of as I'm going through this, so I don't interrupt. As you're doing this, so like you start off with the light roast, and there's still some water in these beans. So as you roast it, a lot of that water is going to evaporate first, and then once that water starts evaporating, you're going to get the Maillard reaction happening. So anyone know what the Maillard reaction is? And look at people I've had. Yeah. So I mean, it's like an amino acid reaction. A lot of people like to confuse it with caramelization. Like, it happens on bread, it happens on steak. So people say, like, when you sear a steak, you know, they'll say, like, get that steak really well caramelized. You're really not caramelizing it. It's the Maillard reaction. But it kind of gives you these like toasty, nutty flavors. So you're going to get that happening first, and you'll kind of smell it first with like, you'll get the toast, the nut, and I'm sure you'll be able to smell it here in a couple minutes. As the water comes out, after that Maillard reaction happens, once it starts getting to around 325 Fahrenheit, that's when you're going to get caramelization happening. So you'll start hearing crack, and that's when you're going to get like those cooked sugar smells. So like caramel, those little bit darker flavors. You can kind of see like that pulp's flying off now. But once you start hearing that crack sound, it'll sound like Rice Krispies popping off, is when you'll... There we go. Is when you'll start getting that other round. And this process doesn't take long. It's like 5-10 minutes at the most. But it also depends on how dark you want to take it. He's not wanting to take it too far, but this isn't like an hour-long process.
It's better to do this outside.
So yeah, and this is something you can do at home. Like a lot of times, like it's done in ovens. The way it's typically really done, like if you're like a business that's roasting your own beans, is you have these big steel drums that kind of like rotate and have heat going into them, and so they kind of tumble over themselves so that you don't. So the heat gets evenly distributed, and you're not burning one side over the other. But here briefly, but we're jerry-rigging a popcorn popper to kind of do the same thing. So there are ways of MacGyvering this on your own. And I'm realizing that's a term that most of you probably is going right over your heads when I say MacGyvering something. But, and they will go like, they'll stop being light green. They'll go to like that lighter blonde color and darker the more we go. Feel free to come in and see if you like. But beyond that, feel free to come look at that. What other questions do you all have while we're cooking some beans up?
Hi, can you speak to how climate change is going to affect growing on a mass production, the decrease that like Ethiopia is forecasting and so forth?
So the question was, Steve, how is global warming going to affect the growth of coffee and like Ethiopia and stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. So as we mentioned, food affects the climate and climate affects food growth. So one of the things that we know is as climate change occurs, the predictability of the weather, the rainfall, temperature swings, high temperatures, low temperatures, those are becoming more predictable. And we know that coffee already has a very narrow range of where it can grow and the conditions in which it can grow. So there are places where, the temperatures are increasing for periods of the year. Rainfall especially is being affected. So there are places where coffee is grown where, if you get a deluge of rain and, it depletes soil, it also increases the likelihood of the pests, the fungal pathogens, and even insect pathogens of the crop. Something we didn't talk very much about that we'll talk about with the students that are going to go on the study abroad trip as part of the curricular part. But it's basically the same challenges with any other kind of crop. It's going to be harder to grow those those crops the way we've been doing it, simply because it's going to make even a narrow window of where they can grow even more narrow. Increase of, like I said, increase in the types of pathogens and the migration of pathogens that migrate through. So, although all of those are challenges, and that's not even touching on the human aspect that our guests next week will talk about, because we talk about the planet, we also need to talk about the people. And sustainability, the triple bottom line, we've got the planet, the people, and then the economy. And all three of those aspects are going to be affected, unfortunately. So there's a lot underway, something I wasn't able to build into this talk, but we'll talk about it in the course, the travel course, which is the different organizations that are working toward looking to the future to make coffee sustainable into the future. One of that has to do with finding strains of coffee that are more resilient. Growing that really good quality Arabica, but, is there a way to make it more resilient, much the way that the Robusta coffee is? It's less particular, but still provides those flavor profiles we like. Integrated pest management approaches are being used to deal with the pest problem, the pathogen problem. Water resource management, right? The Café Terrezu not only reharvest the pulp, but they also reclaim a lot of the water that can then go back on the land as fertilizer. So a lot of these things are happening in the industry, but and it's going to have to if coffee is going to continue to be something that we can actually afford. The cost is going to go up, but we don't want it to go up to where only a few people can enjoy it. Great question, and that's kind of at the heart of all this. One of the things I wanted people to know is more about where coffee comes from, how it gets here, that processing that happens in country, and then the roasting and grinding that happens, at its destination, but also just all the footprint of coffee. And it's not that I think that we should stop drinking coffee or drinking less, but just be aware of it. You should always, I think, be aware of what we're consuming. Other questions? Are we going to have different coffee next time? Oh, great question. It's always good to ask about the refreshments, and that's just good advice anywhere. I think this is finally picking me up now. Yes, we're going to have coffee. We're going to have coffee at every session. It will be slightly different next time. It's going to be based on our presenters. So we've got Erica Noguera, who's the CEO of the Doña Fina Coffee in Guatemala. She's going to talk about her product, so we'll have her coffee. And then we'll also have one of the other presenters had to pull out at the last minute because he had to go back to Ethiopia. So understandably, we had to, we can't fault him for that, for not being here, but we're going to try to get a replacement to talk about their coffee as well. So we'll have it for you to sample. The third, 2 weeks from today, Nick is going to put on a cupping exercise, a coffee cupping. So if you don't know what that is, you got to come back in 2 weeks and participate in that.
Fancy coffee tasting. So blind tasting coffee, evaluating it for like flavor and aromas, and then we're going to compare some coffees, so see how the roast affects it, maybe how the processing affects it, just having it side by side to kind of see that, all coffee doesn't taste, the same, and kind of a fun little tasting exercise. We'll talk about taste and the physiology of flavor and stuff like that too, but be a good chance to come and get highly caffeinated. But there are limited seats, so if you want to come to that, sign up for it. You have the QR code and take a spot. But yeah, as that was roasting, did you kind of hear the little popping, the little crackling? That's when they say the first crack, second crack, when it really starts to open up, and that's kind of when you start knowing that those flavors are being developed and the smell changed. I don't know, everyone can smell that in here, very nice aromatic. But yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Feel free to ask us questions afterwards. We can taste this French press we made here. Feel free to get some coffee to go and snacks, but just finish off that. And so this here is the same kind of the coffee that we just roasted. So if you kind of want to taste the freshly roasted.
Small producer in Costa Rica called Café San Luis. San Luis is a little town near the town of Monteverde. If you know Monteverde, it's a very big tourist attraction place. The Cloud Forest Preserve is there. A lot of people, tourists go there to see that. There's zip lining and all that kind of stuff, waterfalls. It's a beautiful place in the rainforest. And just below, down the hill, down slope, is a small little community called San Luis. So this is a small family farm. So very, very small production. This, I believe, is wet processed coffee, and roasted by yours truly. So, and Nick was talking a little bit about the roasting. That's a huge impact on flavor, because the roasters, the professional roasters around town or anywhere, are using equipment where it's very, very precisely controlled. Was this precisely controlled, what I did here? No, very imprecise. So, and one of the caveats is, they want to get that temperature up very, very quickly to the optimal temperature. So they'll have sensors on the actual burners. They'll have sensors in the coffee beans as they're, flying around to keep track of, all the precise temperatures. But, they want to bring it up as quickly as possible and get it at that optimal place and keep it there for a certain amount of time. The way we did it, we ramped up very slowly in temperature because of the nature of, the high-end equipment that we had. So it's not going to be a high-end coffee. I mean, it's not going to taste, perfect. But if you sample it, you're going to know it. It tastes like coffee. If we had ground up the green beans, which would be hard to do, it wouldn't taste like coffee. You wouldn't want to drink that. So a huge difference. So anyway, but other questions did you guys have? Anything else that you'd like to ask about coffee? Yes. Do we have? Oh, did we lose our person? Oh, hang on. Here.
Well, I'm just kind of curious, more like to learn more about like the lives of the immigrant workers that you visited on the farms. Hear more about that.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, definitely next week. Come back you're going to need to come back next week. However, quickly, I can tell you that, Costa Rica is in Central America. It's a, big producer of coffee. Guatemala is also a big producer of coffee in Central America. Mexico is a producer of coffee. But for almost all the Central American and Mexico, a lot of the workers are migrant workers. So in Costa Rica, you'd think that it'd be the Costa Rican people that are picking the coffee, and it's not. A lot of them are from Honduras, some from Panama, some from even Guatemala. There's migration. There's human migration all through there, and they're going to where the jobs are, or what their traditional places where their families would go. So these are poor people. They're migrant workers. Here in the United States, we think of the migrant workers that come in from Mexico or other places that come up to Washington State, for example, to pick apples. Most of the apples you buy in the grocery store are picked by migrant workers, growing on these big, orchards, So it's the same issue there. And what's interesting, and one of the reasons why we wanted to take students to Coape Terrazú, which is in kind of the heart of Costa Rica, is that they're the biggest co-op in Costa Rica right now, but they're also leading the charge in making a lot of these changes in how they operate. So I think currently, at least at the time, 2 years ago, or whatever it was, a year and a half ago, they were the only co-op that had a daycare facility on the premises for the children of the migrant workers. Because ordinarily, if you're, you have young kids and you're coming into Costa Rica to pick coffee beans, coffee cherries, your kids are just in the fields playing, and you just tend to them in the fields, as you go through your working, through your day. And the workers, on average, it said that, a good picker can pick 200 pounds of coffee cherries. That's like not that everybody's doing that, but that's like a good harvest. So, they're busy, they're working, but, they'd have to take care of their kids. It's probably not the best environment for kids in terms of learning and development. So this co-op wanted to establish a daycare. So we actually the students were able to visit the daycare. We brought donations down when we came down to visit, to, coloring books, crayons, markers, and supplies like that the students got to use. So yeah, there's definitely a human aspect. Everywhere around the world that coffee is being picked, it's human. It's just interesting that every cherry is picked by somebody's hands. There are exceptions. In Brazil, the biggest producer, there's a lot of automation. There's also a lot of more monoculture coffee production there. And there it's an industrial scale. So, the machine comes in and you can't be picky. It picks all the cherries, not the ripe ones. And when you're looking at the picture of the coffee cherries, they're not all, it was my first image. One image showed some that were ready to go and some that weren't, all right next to each other, right? So it's the humans that are coming in and picking the right ones. So you're not, you're going to pick, these, and you're not going to pick some of these others. Machines don't discriminate. They just rip it off. So there's a huge human factor to this product that we consume, massive quantities of. So it is a big part of this. And that's why we wanted to have that second session devoted to that topic. Great question. You need to take the class.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a little bit over time. Thanks to our speakers. Thank you guys for listening. We really appreciate it. As I know you've mentioned, please sign up if you're interested in the cupping coming up in 2 weeks. And feel free, there's more cookies and coffee over here on the side. Thank you guys.